Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national broadcaster about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and India's involvement in shaping a better world order. Viewers, in this episode, we are doing a stock taking of India's presidency of G20, the group of 20. 2022 December is when India took over as the president of the G20, and the whole of this year, 2023, we have been spearheading the entire G20 process, the deliberations, the consultations, and the summit that is coming. So, we are going to be talking about what all has India achieved during its presidency and what can we expect going forward. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a very special guest who has joined me in the studio today, Mr. V. Srinivas. Mr. V. Srinivas is a senior civil servant from the Indian Administrative Service. He has been Secretary to the Government of India and is currently in the Ministry of Personnel. He has been Chief of Staff to India's Foreign Minister as well as Finance Minister, and a well-known author who is an expert on multilateral issues. He has actually written this book on the G20, the roadmap to G20, about the build-up to India's presidency and what all have been done in the previous summits and what we can expect from the India summit that's coming up in September. So, Srinivas ji, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you for inviting me.
Srinivas ji, so we have all, been observing the Indian presidency closely with a lot of pride and stakeholdership, ownership. For us, this is a historic moment. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that it's going to be an action-oriented, decisive and ambitious presidency. And of course, you have been tracking it so closely. You've been involved in multilateral diplomacy before in your career, and you've written so much about the G20 presidency. So looking back now, how would you assess overall? I mean, compared to previous summits, which you have chronicled in great detail in your book as well, how would you rate our presidency?
The Indian presidency commenced on 1st December 2022, and it was under the theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. And on this occasion, when India took the presidency, the Honorable Prime Minister said that India's G20 presidency will be inclusive, it will be ambitious and action-oriented and decisive. And for a nation that is deeply committed to multilateralism, the G20 presidency marks a very significant moment in India's history. And we took charge at a time when the world was seriously grappling with geopolitical tensions, as also rising food prices and the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the world looked at the Indian G20 presidency with great hope. And 9 months into the presidency, it can be said that the Indian presidency has been inclusive, it has been action-oriented, and it has been decisive. We have witnessed a people's movement wherein which every state and union territory government participated in the G20 process.
You've written that we have done more than 200 meetings in 56 different locations across the country. I don't think any G20 host has ever spread out the process so much.
Yes, the G20 process was truly a people's movement in which from Srinagar to Dholavira to Puri, the G20 logo illuminated over 100 monuments, and India's global dreams were etched on the domestic landscape. And the G20 presidency belonged to the entire nation. And the global narrative also presented the voices of global south, which often goes unheralded in global fora. And also we presented a huge diversity of our traditions, the values of democracy, sustainable development, yoga, digital technology, removal of corruption, improving ease of doing business, ease of living, and all these were presented in the various fora. And now, as we head into the Leaders Summit in September 2023, the broader theme would be strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. And the Indian presidency has made a significant effort to put together a wide array of national submissions, international coordinated collaborations in both the development track, the finance track, as also in the engagement groups. So I think we have imparted greater momentum to the international efforts to bring about the agenda of growth, jobs and climate during the Indian presidency.
Absolutely. And Mr. Srinivas, the G20 has, like you said, is happening in India at a time when there is a global crisis with multilateralism and loss of faith in multilateralism, and there has been this expectation that India can be a big bridge builder and can heal a lot of the divisions. And in that context, if you see the efforts we have made, the diplomacy behind the scenes to patch the differences, and to you've also spoken about a model of inclusive governance. You said that that's what Indian presidency represents. We have brought in a lot of voices, like you said, which were not heard before. So could we say that this is probably the broadest and the most democratic G20 exercise that we have seen, because so many countries have hosted G20 before, but everyone who's been observing and attending are saying that this has been a really big broad-based effort, and that probably ties in with our own ethos and values, isn't it? So your assessment of how well we have done in terms of this inclusive, this word, I mean, sometimes you hear it like a cliche, but I think we have really lived up to the expectations on this front, isn't it?
Yes, the big thrust area has been the voice of the global south should be presented in the G20 fora, and in every ministerial meeting the impact and the voice of the global south has been carried forward. And let me present to you how the agendas of the finance ministers or the development ministers carried this imprint. For example, in the finance minister's agenda, the food and energy security was a major phenomena, as also handling the global debt vulnerabilities and strengthening multilateral banks. So we had the report of the independent committee on experts to enhance lending of multilateral banks for developmental financing. And the entire issue of completing the debt sustainability frameworks, as also ensuring that debt restructuring took place in a timely manner, was taken forward when India convened the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable in April in Washington DC, in which many countries participated. And thereafter, what we notice is by the third finance ministers meeting, the commitments that came into the major trust funds that the G20 has established, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, it has reached about $45.5 billion. And the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, there the commitments in loan resources have reached about $24.2 billion. And in terms of subsidies, it has reached about $1.9 billion. So there is significant mobilization for developmental financing that we've done. Then we brought in our own successful growth models into the G20, which could be shared with developing countries and developed countries, as also with Global South. For example, digital public infrastructure was a significant area where financial inclusion could be taken up and pursued across the global community. And this found mention even in the finance minister's outcome document that to advance financial inclusion and the productivity gains through digital public infrastructure. The other major area was the life movement, lifestyle for environment. That was a very significant step forward in which climate change, along with a behavioral based movement could be created for improving the climate challenges that we are facing. And lastly, the thrust on sustainable development goals, because it was felt that the implementation of the sustainable development goals agenda of 2030 needed a greater push, and that was what came about in the developmental ministers meeting. And there was also in the agriculture ministers meeting this great push for millets. And it is the International Year of Millets, and India participated in this celebration. The Deccan high level principles on food security and nutrition were adopted. So promoting millet cultivation as also nutrition has been a major theme of the agenda. And so women-led development, lastly, women-led development was another big feature where India's success stories have been shared with the world, particularly Jan Bhagidari in terms of self-help groups where women participation has been enhanced.
Absolutely. So viewers, what Mr. Srinivas is saying is that there's so much that India has achieved, and we need to actually go into the nitty-gritty of issues to be able to really comprehend the depth of the work, the background, the spade work that's been done, and the convening of so many countries and so many interests, and trying to find common ground on each and every one of these issues is not a joke. It's a very, very laborious work of multilateral diplomacy, and that's what we have been doing. Viewers, I have a very interesting video now for you about how India has been thoroughly prepared as being the host and in organizing the G20 proceedings. From the words of foreign delegates who have been coming in, this is a group that came for working group on sustainability, sustainable finance in Guwahati, Assam. Let's get a small glimpse of their views, the visiting delegates, about the Indian presidency, and then continue the discussion.
The Indian presidency organized everything in the smallest details. They didn't forget anything. And secondly, I still see the G20 as a premier forum for international cooperation, and this is felt in the atmosphere during the meetings. People's participation are intended to foster cooperation and find common grounds on every topic.
Well, I'm a climate change expert, work for the European Investment Bank, and I focus mostly on climate change, so I'm really aware of how urgent the problem is and how much, extreme weather events are hitting countries like India and other countries. So it's absolutely critical that we work on getting more finance towards solving the problem. So really important. Yeah.
It was great, and the meeting is very, very well organized with a key focus area that we believe at the OECD will really help mobilizing sustainable finance. So thank you very much.
The Indian presidency of G20 has kicked off very well, and we are very pleased and grateful to be here. Yeah. Sustainable finance, and in particular to mobilize financial resources to support climate action for mitigation, for adaptation, is a very key topic. We need to work together. The whole family, the whole G20 family needs to work together. We need to really scale up transition finance through many innovative approaches, like blended finance, for example, in order to de-risk the investment and crowd in more private capital to support climate finance.
So viewers, you just got a small glimpse of the G20 delegates who have come in from all over the world and who appreciated India's presidency and the stress and the onus that India has given to the interests of developing countries in particular. Coming back to Mr. Srinivas, we just saw this, Mr. Srinivas. The point is, every delegate who has come has been impressed with the depth of issues that we have brought in and the preparations, the backgrounds. We've had a huge secretariat supporting this process, and every state of India has pitched in, like you've said. So they are all talking about issues that are of great relevance to the global south, and like you said before, India has positioned itself to lead this. Prime Minister Modi has said that there is no first world, or he said there is no first world or third world, but there's only one world, and we have to work for it. So that there's so many issues that have happened. There's so many working groups, mechanisms, and so on. So your thoughts on what all has happened at that level? I mean, you spoke about the ministerials. that's something higher, but then there is a lot more that's happening a little lower down in the system of the G20 proceedings, and where all these thousands of delegates have come in from all over the world, and experts have come in, and we have been able to gather. You already mentioned action plans and such things, high principles, these kinds of outcomes that have come out of this. Please tell the audience, what is the value of all this?
As I said, the G20 comprises of the three major tracks. There is a finance track, and there is a development track, which is also called the Sherpa track, and there is the engagement groups track. The broad theme that has been pursued over the past 17 years has been strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. So that has been the motto of the G20.
Issue, yeah.
But every presidency has the freedom to bring in new and innovative features of their choice. So the Indian presidency introduced the Startup 20 group, and the Startup 20, India being one of the largest startup ecosystems in the world and producing a number of unicorns, the Startup 20 has put forth a huge number of new ideas on how to take forward and create a $1 trillion startup ecosystem. So that was a big recommendation that came out of the Startup 20. The other engagement groups have been equally engrossing in that we've had the Think 20, which is an agglomeration of think tanks across the world, and the Think 20 came forward with very innovative ideas. For example, they said, let us set up an expert group on global governance reform, especially membership of the United Nations Security Council, the use of veto power and rules and status of non-permanent members. They've also suggested a G20 digital health global initiative which will connect the digital health ecosystems. We had the Saudi presidency, which was successful in creating the COVAX, the tools, accelerator platform. But the Indian presidency's Think 20 takes it a step forward. So in many ways, while the engagement groups represent a continuation of an ongoing process, the new engagement groups have brought in greater thinking and depth into understanding as to how global governance can be taken forward.
Absolutely. So viewers, what Mr. Srinivas is saying is that the G20's proceedings and outcomes do matter to all of us. It's not like this is just a talking shop, or people are just signing on to a piece of paper which will be worthless. Actually, there is a follow-up process. There is a attempt to implement. The G20 does not have an enforcement power of its own. It's not a very formal kind of a international organization. It's more like an institution, but the guidance and the overall principles that they disseminate will be then expected to be implemented on the ground in all the member countries, and indeed even beyond them. So that's a very important thing. But viewers, it's not been easy going in terms of the politics, and this is something we must also discuss. While the G20's core focuses on economic issues primarily, and coordination of economic issues among the major economies of the world, there is the obstacle of geopolitical divisions, and Indian presidency, we have witnessed that also, especially around the Russia-Ukraine war. On this, I have an interesting clip from India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, talking about why there could not be a joint communique after the foreign ministers ministerial of the G20. Let's hear Dr. Jaishankar and continue.
There was a chair summary because there were differences on the Ukraine issue which we could not reconcile between various parties who held differing positions. Now, is the conflict impacting the global south? Of course it is. I mean, it's not something new. In fact, India has been saying this very strongly for pretty much close to a year, that this is affecting. In fact, today in my own session, I actually used the word saying, for much of the global south, this is a make or break issue. That the costs of fuel, the cost of food, the cost of fertilizer, the availability of fertilizer, which means next year's food, these are all extremely pressing issues. And if you see some of the some of the countries who were already struggling with debt, who were already impacted by the pandemic. For them, this conflict, the knock-on effects of this conflict coming on top of that has been really, damaging is a very, very mild word. So it is a matter of very, very deep concern for us, which is why we have kept the focus in this meeting very much on the concerns of the Global South. We feel these are the most vulnerable countries. It's not realistic, it's not credible to talk about the future of the global economy and the multilateral order if we are not able to really address and focus on the issues of those who are most in need. So that's been broadly the approach. So just to sum up, I would say in terms of the outcome document, which we will be putting out very, very shortly, you will see that, the bulk, there is, almost, I would say, 95% in terms of paragraph agreement. And it is just on 2 paragraphs that we were not able to get everybody on the same page or same para, as you might call it.
So, viewers, India's External Affairs Minister saying 95% of the issues, the foreign ministers, finance ministers, most of them agree, but then 1 or 2 paragraphs there is no agreement, and therefore there is no joint communique. Instead, we issue what is called a chair summary, and that is short of a joint communique. Coming back to Mr. Srinivas, this division at the global level, we had hoped to heal and to transform and to bring about unanimity around the Prime Minister Modi's idea of a human-centric globalization and all that. Now, how far do you think we've been able to succeed? I mean, there is the Russia-China axis on one side against the West, and often they are split. And then there is a broader North-South, Global South and Global North divisions that have existed for a long time. So, India was expected to be the big bridge between all these competing factions, and so how would you assess Indian presidency on that parameter, and how far have we been able to minimize the differences? I read Prime Minister Modi saying that we should focus on what unites us rather than the issues that divide us, and try to depoliticize a lot of these issues so that the poor, especially in the developing world, do not suffer because of the battles between the big powers. So how would you assess our presidency on that front?
It's a very interesting question, and let me present to you the gamut of work that went on with regard to how the North-South division could be bridged. We had the Honorable Prime Minister of Japan, His Excellency Mr. Fumio Kishida, who visited India in March 2023, and the Honorable Prime Minister visited Hiroshima to attend the G7 summit as a special invitee. And the personal chemistry between the Honorable Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of Japan meant that they could align the G7 presidency agenda of Japan with the G20 presidency agenda of India in a large number of areas. And that was
G7
how,
being the representative of the global north.
yes, of the advanced countries or the developed countries of the world. And so the G7 and the G7 plus countries discussed issues of debt sustainability, helping overcome countries with facing debt crisis, also the supply chain reliability and spearheading alternate energy coalitions, infrastructure development. These were areas that they worked on, and the outcome statements have said that the G20 is not the forum to resolve security issues, while they have acknowledged that security issues can have significant consequences on the global economy.
Right. So, yeah, there are some things only that the G20 can solve and not everything, and that's understood. Last point, Mr. Srinivas, you have written that Prime Minister's push to admit the African Union as a 21st member of the G20. Right now we have 19 major economies and the European Union, which is of course a regional organization. But to bring in the African Union, and we have pushed hard, and I think there's going to be consensus on bringing them in as another member in a formal way. That is, you have said, is one of the great achievements of the Indian presidency. Why do you think so? And do you think that this is going to happen soon, and if so, would we be able to see the African Union represented? Already South Africa, Nigeria, for example, are there as individual countries. But to bring in the AU as a whole, representing 55 countries, it's a big move by India, isn't it? And this is probably something that will have a lasting impact on the very format and the structure of G20 going forward.
Indeed, Prime Minister Modi has repeatedly highlighted the importance of revitalized and reformed multilateralism in a number of his addresses, and be it at the United Nations General Assembly or in his addresses to at the G20 in the previous summit meetings, and even in under the Indian presidency, he has tried to revitalize multilateralism in his addresses to the finance ministers, the foreign ministers, the environment ministers and the agriculture ministers, citing each time the need to improve and make multilateralism more inclusive. One of the big steps that they have taken forward in this year under the Indian presidency was to offer, to send out an invitation to the African Union to be given full membership at the upcoming Delhi summit. And this Prime Minister has said would be a right step towards a just, fair, inclusive and representative global architecture and governance. So this goes in consonance with the Voice of Global South summit that India had hosted. The African Union represents 55 African member countries and has been working towards growth and economic progress of the African continent. So the African Union has expressed deep appreciation for India's support, and it has called on all other G20 member countries to support India's proposal. So perhaps it's time for Africa.
It's time for Africa, says Mr. V. Srinivas, and viewers. The point is, India has tried to use the G20 as an instrument to improve the state of the world and to make it fairer, more just and more equitable. And this, I think, is going to be remembered in history. No doubt the very hosting of G20 has galvanized so much interest within India about world affairs and global problems, and has positioned India as a potential provider of solutions to global problems. Vishwaguru, as our Prime Minister calls it. And I think we have lived up to that billing very much. I want to thank Mr. V. Srinivas for sharing valuable insights on technically complex issues. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm sure we look forward to the Leaders Summit of September 2023.
Absolutely. The whole world is looking forward to the Leaders Summit of the G20 that India is hosting, and we have indeed shown our mettle on the world stage as a bridge builder and as a consensus builder. And I think going forward, the legacy of the Indian presidency will continue to build upon, to be built upon by future countries. Brazil and many others are coming next in line to continue the G20 and to carry forward the baton. The world's problems remain quite severe, both political and economic. And I think the whole idea of the Indian presidency was to remind us that we need something collective, or else, you know, we will have nothing but world disorder. So I think the stakes are very high, viewers. Let's keep an eye on the Indian presidency that continues in 2023, and also the legacy of the Indian presidency, which is going to be beneficial for the future of humanity. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care.